Could you keep a secret? It's a great secret. If anyone discovers it, I'll die. I keep secrets for all the wild birds and animals on the moor. So I can keep yours too, he replied. I've stolen a garden, she said very fast. Nobody goes into it. Nobody wants it. I love it, and nobody takes care of it. They're letting it die. And she threw her arms over her face and started crying. Don't cry, said Dickon gently. Where is it? Come with me, and I'll show you, said Miss Mary. They went to the secret garden and entered it together. Dickon walked round, looking at everything. Martha told me about this place, but I never thought I'd see it, he said. It's wonderful. What about the roses? Asked Mary worriedly. Are they still alive? What do you think? Look at these shoots on the branches. Most of them are alive, all right. He took out his knife and cut away some of the dead wood from the rose trees. Mary showed him the work she had done in the garden, and they talked as they cut and cleared. Dickon, said Mary suddenly, I like you. I never thought I'd like as many as 5 people. Only 5, laughed Dickon. He did look funny when he laughed, thought Mary. Yes, your mother, Martha, the robin, Ben, and you. Then she asked him a question in Yorkshire dialect, because that was his language. Does thou like me? Was her question. Of course. I likes thee wonderful, replied Dickon, a big smile on his round face. Mary had never been so happy. When she went back to the house for her lunch, she told Martha about Dickon's visit. I've got news for you too, said Martha. Mr. Craven's come home and wants to see you. He's going away again tomorrow for several months. Oh, said Mary, that was good news. She would have all summer in the secret garden before he came back. But she must be careful. He mustn't guess her secret now. Just then, Mrs. Medlock arrived, in her best black dress, to take Mary down to Mr. Craven's room. Mary's uncle had black hair with some white in it, and high, crooked shoulders. His face was not ugly, but very sad. During their conversation, he watched her in a worried way. Perhaps he was thinking of other things at the same time. He looked at the thin child. Are you well? He asked. Mary tried to keep her voice calm as she replied, I'm getting stronger and healthier. What do you want to do in this big, empty house? I just want to play outside. I enjoy that. Yes. Martha's mother, Susan Sowerby, spoke to me the other day. She's a sensible woman, and she said you needed fresh air. But where do you play? Everywhere. I just skip and run and look for green shoots. I don't damage anything. Don't look so frightened. Of course, a child like you couldn't damage anything. Play where you like. Is there anything that you want? Mary came a step nearer to him, and her voice shook a little as she spoke. Could I have a bit of garden? Mr. Craven looked very surprised. To plant seeds in. To make them come alive, Mary went on bravely. It was too hot in India, so I was always ill and tired there. But here it's different. I love the garden. He passed a hand quickly over his eyes. Then he looked kindly at Mary. I knew someone once who loved growing things like you. Yes, child. Take as much of the garden as you want. He smiled gently at her. Now leave me. I'm very tired. Mary ran all the way back to her room. Martha! She shouted. Mr. Craven's really a nice man. But he looks very unhappy. He said I can have my own garden. She was planning to work in the garden with Dickon every day to make it beautiful for the summer. Chapter 5. Meeting Colin. In the middle of the night, Mary woke up. Heavy rain had started falling again, and the wind was blowing violently round the walls of the old house. Suddenly, she heard crying again. This time, she decided to discover who it was. She left her room and in the darkness followed the crying sound, round corners and through doors, up and down stairs, to the other side of the big house. At last, she found the right room. She pushed the door open and went in. It was a big room with beautiful old furniture and pictures. In the large bed was a boy who looked tired and cross, with a thin, white, tearful face. He stared at Mary. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Are you a dream?" "No, I'm not. I'm Mary Lennox. Mr. Craven's my uncle." "He's my father," said the boy. "I'm Colin Craven." "No one ever told me he had a son," said Mary, very surprised. "Well, no one ever told me you'd come to live here. I'm ill, you see, I don't want people to see me and talk about me. If I live, I may have a crooked back like my father, but I'll probably die. What a strange house this is, said Mary. So many secrets. Does your father come and see you often? Not often. He doesn't like seeing me because it makes him remember my mother. She died when I was born, so he almost hates me, I think. Why do you say you're going to die? Asked Mary. I've always been ill. I've nearly died several times. And my back's never been strong. My doctor feels sure that I'm going to die. But he's my father's cousin and very poor, so he'd like me to die. Then he'd get all the money when my father dies. He gives me medicine and tells me to rest. We had a grand doctor from London once who told me to go out in the fresh air and try to get well. But I hate fresh air. And another thing, all the servants have to do what I want, because if I'm angry, I become ill. Mary thought she liked this boy, although he seemed so strange. He asked her lots of questions, and she told him all about her life in India. "How old are you?" he asked suddenly. "I'm 10, and so are you," replied Mary, forgetting to be careful, because when you were born, the garden door was locked, and the key was buried. And I know that was 10 years ago. Colin sat up in bed and looked very interested. "What door? Who locked it? Where's the key? I want to see it. I'll make the servants tell me where it is. They'll take me there, and you can come too." "Oh, please don't! Don't do that!" cried Mary. Colin stared at her. "Don't you want to see it?" "Yes, but if you make them open the door, it will never be a secret again. You see, if only we know about it, if we can find the key, we can go and play there every day. We can help the garden come alive again. And no one will know about it except us." "I see," said Colin slowly. "Yes, I'd like that. It'll be our secret. I've never had a secret before." "And perhaps," added Mary cleverly, "we can find a boy to push you in your wheelchair if you can't walk, and we can go there together without any other people. You'll feel better outside. I know I do." "I'd like that," he said dreamily. "I think I'd like fresh air in a secret garden." Then Mary told him about the moor, and Dickon, and Ben Weatherstaff, and the robin. And Colin listened to it all with great interest. He began to smile and look much happier. I like having you here," he said. "You must come and see me every day. But I'm tired now. I'll sing you a song. My servant Kamala used to do that in India," said Mary. And very soon Colin was asleep. The next afternoon, Mary visited Colin again, and he seemed very pleased to see her. He had sent his nurse away and had told nobody about Mary's visit. Mary had not told anybody either. They read some of his books together and told each other stories. They were enjoying themselves and laughing loudly when suddenly the door opened. Dr. Craven and Mrs. Medlock came in. They almost fell over in surprise. "What's happening here?" asked Dr. Craven. Colin sat up straight. To Mary, he looked just like an Indian prince. "This is my cousin, Mary Lennox," he said calmly. "I like her. She must visit me often." "Oh, I'm sorry, sir," said poor Mrs. Medlock to the doctor. "I don't know how she discovered him. I told the servants to keep it a secret." "Don't be stupid, Medlock," said the Indian prince coldly. "Nobody told her. She heard me crying and found me herself. Bring our tea up now." "I'm afraid you're getting too hot and excited, my boy," said Dr. Craven. "That's not good for you. Don't forget you're ill." "I want to forget," said Colin. "I'll be angry if Mary doesn't visit me. She makes me feel better." Dr. Craven did not look happy when he left the room. "What a change in the boy, sir," said the housekeeper. "He's usually so disagreeable with all of us. He really seems to like that strange little girl. And he does look better." Dr. Craven had to agree. Chapter 6. Colin is Afraid. Because it rained all the next week, Mary went to talk to Colin every day instead of visiting the garden. But she woke early one morning to see the sun shining into her room, and she ran out to the secret garden at once. She did not even wait to have her breakfast. It was beautifully sunny and warm, and 1,000 more shoots were pushing their way out of the ground. Dickon was already there, digging hard, with the crow and a young fox beside him. "Have you seen the robin?" he asked Mary. The little bird was flying busily backwards and forwards as fast as he could, carrying pieces of dry grass. "He's building a nest," whispered Mary. They watched the robin for a moment. Then Mary said, I must tell you something. You probably know about Colin Craven, don't you? Well, I've met him, and I'm going to help him to get better. That's good news. There was a big smile on Dickon's honest face. We all knew he was ill. He's afraid he'll have a crooked back, like his father. I think that's what's making him ill. Perhaps we can bring him here and let him rest under the trees. That'll do him good. That's what we'll do. They had a lot of gardening and planning to do, and Mary did not have time to visit Colin that day. When she came back to the house in the evening, Martha told her that the servants had had trouble with Colin. He's been very bad-tempered all afternoon with all of us, because you didn't come, miss. Well, I was busy. He'll have to learn not to be so selfish, replied Mary coldly. She forgot how selfish she had been when she was ill in India. I'll go and see him now. When she went into his room, he was lying in bed, looking tired. He did not turn to look at her. What's the matter with you? She asked crossly. My back aches and my head hurts. Why didn't you come this afternoon? I was working in the garden with Dickon. I won't let that boy come to the garden if you stay with him instead of talking to me. Mary suddenly became very angry. If you send Dickon away, I'll never come into this room again. You'll have to, if I say so. I'll make the servants bring you in here. Oh, will you, Prince? But no one can make me talk to you. I won't look at you. I'll stare at the floor. You selfish girl, cried Colin. You're more selfish than I am. You're the most selfish boy I've ever met. I'm not as selfish as your fine Dickon. He keeps you playing outside when he knows I'm ill and alone. Mary had never been so furious. Dickon is nicer than any other boy in the world. He's like an angel. An angel? Don't make me laugh. He's just a poor country boy with holes in his shoes. He's 1,000 times better than you are. Colin had never argued with anyone like himself in his life, and in fact, it was good for him. But now, he was beginning to feel sorry for himself. I'm always ill, he said, and started to cry. I'm sure my back is a bit crooked, and I'm going to die. No, you're not, said Mary crossly. Colin opened his eyes very wide. Nobody had said that to him before. He was angry, but a bit pleased at the same time. What do you mean? You know I'm going to die. Everybody says I'm going to die. I don't believe it, said Mary in her most disagreeable voice. You just say that to make people feel sorry for you. You're too horrid to die. Colin forgot about his painful back and sat up in bed. Get out of the room at once! He shouted and threw a book at her. I'm going, Mary shouted in reply. And I won't come back. The door banged shut behind her. When she reached her own room, she had decided never to tell him her great secret. He can stay in his room and die if he wants, she thought. But soon she began to remember how ill he had been and how frightened he was. Frightened that one day his back would become as crooked as his father's. Perhaps I'll go back and see him tomorrow. That night, she was woken by the most terrible screams that she had ever heard. Servants were opening and shutting doors and running about. It's Colin, thought Mary. He'll go on screaming until he makes himself really ill. How selfish he is. Somebody should stop him. Just then, Martha ran into the room. We don't know what to do, she cried. He likes you, miss. Come and see if you can make him calmer, please. Well, I'm very cross with him, said Mary, and jumped out of bed. I'm going to stop him. That's right, said Martha. He needs someone like you to argue with. It'll give him something new to think about. Mary ran into Colin's room, right up to his bed. Stop screaming, she shouted furiously. Stop at once! I hate you! Everybody hates you! You'll die if you go on screaming like this! And I hope you will! The screams stopped immediately. This was the first time that anyone had spoken so angrily to Colin, and he was shocked. But he went on crying quietly to himself. My back's becoming crooked. I can feel it. I know I'm going to die. Large tears ran down his face. Don't be stupid, cried Mary. There's nothing the matter with your horrid back. Martha, come here and help me look at his back. Martha and Mrs. Medlock were standing at the door, staring at Mary, their mouths half open. They both looked very frightened. Martha came forward to help, and Miss Mary looked carefully at Colin's thin white back, up and down. Her face was serious and angry at the same time. The room was very quiet. There's nothing wrong with your back, she said at last. Nothing at all. It's as straight as mine. Only Colin knew how important those crossly spoken, childish words were. All his life he had been afraid to ask about his back, and his terrible fear had made him ill. Now an angry little girl told him his back was straight, and he believed her. He was no longer afraid. They were both calmer now. He gave Mary his hand. "I think, I'm almost sure I will live, if we can go out in the garden together sometimes. I'm very tired now. Will you stay with me until I go to sleep?" The servants went out very quietly. "I'll tell you all about the secret garden," whispered Mary. "I think it's full of roses and beautiful flowers. Birds like making their nests there because it's so quiet and safe. And perhaps our Robin—" But Colin was already asleep. The next day, Mary met Dickon as usual in the secret garden and told him about Colin. Mary loved Dickon's Yorkshire dialect and was trying to learn it herself. She spoke a little now. "We mun get poor Colin out here in th' sunshine, and we munnot lose no time about it." Dickon laughed. "Well done! I didn't know you could speak Yorkshire. You're right. We must bring Colin to the garden as soon as we can." So that afternoon, she went to see Colin. "I'm sorry I said I'd send Dickon away," he said. "I hated you when you said he was like an angel." "Well, he's a funny kind of angel, but he understands wild animals better than anyone." Suddenly, Mary knew that this was the right moment to tell him. She caught hold of his hands. "Colin, this is important. Can you keep a secret?" "Yes! Yes!" he whispered excitedly. "What is it?" "We found the door into the secret garden." "Oh, Mary! Will I live long enough to see it?" "Of course you will. Don't be stupid," said Mary crossly. But it was a very natural thing to say, and they both laughed. Colin told Mrs. Medlock and the doctor that he wanted to go out in his wheelchair. At first, the doctor was worried the boy would get too tired. But when he heard that Dickon would push the wheelchair, he agreed. "Dickon's a sensible boy," he told Colin. "But don't forget—" "I've told you. I want to forget that I'm ill," said Colin in his prince's voice. "Don't you understand? It's because my cousin makes me forget that I feel better when I'm with her." Chapter 7. Colin and the Garden. Of course, it was most important that no one should see Colin, Mary, or Dickon entering the secret garden. So Colin gave orders to the gardeners that they must all keep away from that part of the garden in future. The next afternoon, Colin was carried downstairs by a manservant and put in his wheelchair outside the front door. Dickon arrived with his crow, 2 squirrels and the fox, and started pushing the wheelchair gently away from the house and into the gardens. Mary walked beside the chair. Spring had really arrived now, and it seemed very exciting to Colin, who had lived indoors for so long. He smelt the warm air from the moor and watched the little white clouds in the blue sky. In a very short time, he heard Mary say, "This is where I found the key. And this is the door. And this is the secret garden." Colin covered his eyes with his hands until he was inside the 4 high walls, and the door was shut again. Then he looked round at the roses climbing the old red walls, the pink and white flowers on the fruit trees, and the birds and the butterflies everywhere. The sun warmed his face, and he suddenly knew he felt different. "Mary! Dickon!" he cried. "I'm going to get better. I'm going to live forever and ever and ever." As Dickon pushed the wheelchair all round the garden, he told Colin the names of all the plants. The sun shone, the birds sang, and in every corner of the garden there was something interesting to look at. The 3 children talked and laughed, and by the end of the afternoon, all 3 were speaking Yorkshire together. "I'll come back here every afternoon," said Colin. "I want to watch things growing. Soon you'll be strong enough to walk and dig. You'll be able to help us with the gardening," said Dickon kindly. "Do you really think I'll be able to walk and dig?" asked Colin. "Of course you will. You got legs like us." "But they're not very strong," answered Colin. "They shake and I'm afraid to stand on them." "When you want to use them, you'll be able to," said Dickon. The garden was quiet for a moment. Suddenly Colin said, "Who's that?" Mary turned her head and noticed Ben Weatherstaff's angry face looking at her over the garden wall. "What are you doing in that garden, young miss?" he shouted. He had not seen Colin or Dickon. "The robin showed me the way, Ben," she replied. You! He stopped shouting, and his mouth dropped open as he saw Dickon pushing a boy in a wheelchair over the grass towards him. "Do you know who I am?" asked the boy in the chair. Old Ben stared. "You've got your mother's eyes," he said in a shaking voice. "Yes, I know you. You're Mr. Craven's son, the little boy with a crooked back." Colin forgot that he had ever had backache. "My back's as straight as yours is," he shouted. Ben stared and stared. He only knew what he had heard from the servants. "You haven't got a crooked back?" he asked. "Or crooked legs?" That was too much. Colin was furious, and it made him feel strong. "Come here, Dickon," he shouted, and threw off his blanket. Dickon was by his side in a second. Mary felt sick with fear. Could Colin stand? Then Colin's thin feet were on the grass, and he was standing, holding Dickon's arm. He looked strangely tall, and he held his head very high. "Look at me!" he shouted at Ben. "Just look at me!" "He's as straight as any boy in Yorkshire," said Dickon. Tears were running down Ben's brown old face. "They said you were going to die," he whispered. "Well, you can see that's not true," said Colin. "Now, get down from the wall and come here. I want to talk to you. You've got to help us keep the garden a secret." "Yes, sir," said old Ben as he dried his eyes. That was the first of many beautiful afternoons in the secret garden. Colin was brought there by Dickon and Mary nearly every day, and he saw all the changes that happened there during the spring and early summer. Ben Weatherstaff, now in the secret, joined them as often as he could. One day, Colin spoke to all of them. "Listen, everybody. I think there's something like magic that makes gardens grow and things happen. Perhaps, if I believe in it, the magic will make me strong. Let's all sit down in a circle and ask the magic to work." So they all sat on the grass in a circle. Dickon with his crow, his fox, and the 2 squirrels, Mary, Colin, and Ben. Colin repeated these words several times. "The sun's shining. That's the magic. Being strong. That's the magic. Magic, help me. Magic, help me." At last, Colin stopped. "Now, I'm going to walk round the garden," he said, and took Dickon's arm. Slowly, he walked from one wall to another, followed closely by Mary and Ben. And when he had walked all the way round, he said, "You see, I can walk now. The magic worked." "It's wonderful," cried Mary. "Your father will think he's dreaming when he sees you." "I won't tell him yet. I'm going to keep it a secret from everybody. I'll come to the garden and walk and run a little more every day until I'm as healthy as any other boy. Then, when my father comes home, I'll walk up to him and say, 'Here I am, Father. You see, I'm not going to die.'" Now began a difficult time for Colin and Mary. Dickon told his mother about it one evening as he was digging the cottage garden. "You see, Mother, they don't want the doctor or the servants to guess that Colin can walk and is getting better. So they have to pretend he's still ill and just as disagreeable as he used to be. If they're running about all day in the fresh air, that'll make them hungry, I should think." "Yes, that's the problem. They're both getting fatter and healthier, and they really enjoy their food now. But they have to send some of it back to the kitchen, uneaten. If they eat it all, people will realize how healthy they are. Sometimes they're very hungry. I know what we can do, said Mrs. Sowerby. You can take some fresh milk and some of my newly baked bread to the garden in the mornings. If they have that, it'll do them a lot of good. What a game those children are playing! And she laughed until tears came to her eyes. One afternoon, when they were all working in the garden, the door opened and a woman came quietly in. "It's Mother!" cried Dickon, and ran towards her. "I told her where the door was, because I knew she would keep the secret." Colin held out his hand to her. "I've wanted to see you for a long time," he said. "Dear boy," Susan Sowerby whispered, holding his hand. "You're so like your mother." "Do you think," asked Colin carefully, "that will make my father like me?" "I'm sure it will," she answered warmly. "He must see you. He must come home now." "You see how healthy the boy is, Susan?" asked old Ben. "Look how strong and straight his legs are now." "Yes," she laughed. "Playing and working outside and eating good Yorkshire food has made him strong. And Miss Mary, too," she added, turning to Mary. "Mrs. Medlock heard that your mother was a pretty woman. You'll soon be as pretty as she was." "Do you believe in magic?" Colin asked her. "I do," she answered. "But everybody gives it a different name. It makes the sun shine and the seeds grow, and it has made you healthy." She sat down on the grass and stayed for a while, talking and laughing with the children in the quiet, sunny garden. When she stood up to leave, Colin suddenly put out a hand to her. "I wish you were my mother," he whispered. Mrs. Sowerby put her arms round him and held him to her. "Dear boy, you're as close to your mother as you could be, here in her garden. And your father'll come back soon." Chapter 8. Mr. Craven Comes Home. While the secret garden was returning to life, a man with high, crooked shoulders was wandering round the most beautiful places in Europe. For 10 years he had lived this lonely life, his heart full of sadness and his head full of dark dreams. Everywhere he went, he carried his unhappiness with him, like a black cloud. Other travellers thought he was half mad, or a man who could not forget some terrible crime. His name was Archibald Craven. But one day, as he sat by a mountain stream, he actually looked at a flower, and for the first time in 10 years, he realized how beautiful something living could be. The valley seemed very quiet as he sat there, staring at the flower. He felt strangely calm. "What is happening to me?" he whispered. "I feel different. I almost feel I'm alive again." At that moment, hundreds of miles away in Yorkshire, Colin was seeing the secret garden for the first time and saying, "I'm going to live forever and ever and ever." But Mr. Craven did not know this. That night, in his hotel room, he slept better than usual. As the weeks passed, he even began to think a little about his home and his son. One evening in late summer, as he was sitting quietly beside a lake, he felt the strange calmness again. He fell asleep and had a dream that seemed very real. He heard a voice calling him. It was sweet and clear and happy. The voice of his young wife. "Archie! Archie! Archie!" "My dear." He jumped up. "Where are you?" "In the garden," called the beautiful voice. And then the dream ended. In the morning, when he woke, he remembered the dream. "She says she's in the garden," he thought, "but the door's locked and the key's buried." That morning, he received a letter from Susan Sowerby. In it, she asked him to come home, but she did not give a reason. Mr. Craven thought of his dream and decided to return to England immediately. On the long journey back to Yorkshire, he was thinking about Colin. "I wonder how he is. I wanted to forget him because he makes me think of his mother. He lived, and she died. But perhaps I've been wrong. Susan Sowerby says I should go home. So perhaps she thinks I can help him." When he arrived home, he found the housekeeper very confused about Colin's health. "He's very strange, sir," said Mrs. Medlock. "He looks better, it's true, but some days he eats nothing at all, and other days he eats just like a healthy boy. He used to scream even at the idea of fresh air, but now he spends all his time outside in his wheelchair with Miss Mary and Dickon Sowerby. He's in the garden at the moment." "In the garden?" repeated Mr. Craven. Those were the words of the dream. He hurried out of the house and towards the place which he had not visited for so long. He found the door with the climbing plant over it and stood outside, listening for a moment. "Surely I can hear voices inside the garden," he thought. "Aren't there children whispering, laughing, running in there? Or am I going mad?" And then the moment came when the children could not stay quiet. There was wild laughing and shouting, and the door was thrown open. A boy ran out. A tall, healthy, handsome boy, straight into the man's arms. Mr. Craven stared into the boy's laughing eyes. Who? He cried. Colin had not planned to meet his father like this. But perhaps this was the best way. to come running out with his cousin and his friend. "Father," he said, "I'm Colin. You can't believe it. I can't believe it myself. It was the garden, and Mary and Dickon, and the magic that made me well. We've kept it a secret up to now. Aren't you happy, Father? I'm going to live for ever and ever and ever." Mr. Craven put his hands on the boy's shoulders. For a moment he could not speak. "Take me into the garden, my boy," he said at last, "and tell me all about it." And in the secret garden, where the roses were at their best, and the butterflies were flying from flower to flower in the summer sunshine, they told Colin's father their story. Sometimes he laughed, and sometimes he cried, but most of the time he just looked, unbelieving, into the handsome face of the son that he had almost forgotten. "Now," said Colin at the end, "it isn't a secret any more. I'll never use the wheelchair again. I'm going to walk back with you, Father, to the house." And so, that afternoon, Mrs. Medlock, Martha, and the other servants had the greatest shock of their lives. Through the gardens, towards the house, came Mr. Craven, looking happier than they had ever seen him. And by his side, with his shoulders straight, his head held high, and a smile on his lips, walked young Colin.